White House clearing the air after US Supreme Court strikes down Trump tariff. So what are we looking at now in the present circumstance as we speak on February 21st? The Trump administration has informed that India will now be facing a global 10% tariff. And not just India, all other countries across the globe shall be facing this tariff, which the US has a trade, whichever country has a US trade deal. And now the White House further stated that a temporary 10% rate will remain in effect for the next 150 days and that the global 10% tariff is effective immediately. This comes after the apex of the United States ruled that Trump exceeded his authority by imposing tariffs using the emergency powers. The court said he requires the congressional approval to enforce such tariffs in the first place. However, refusing to go back down, Trump announced this global 10% tariff on all nations across the globe. Trump also sharply came out to criticize the verdict, calling the justices a disgrace, labeling the very decision unpatriotic, and claiming the Democrats are thrilled by the ruling. Meanwhile, Trump asserted that the US-India trade deal remains unchanged. He also praised Prime Minister Modi, once again calling him a fantastic man who's much smarter than others. So we will get into the discussion and details of all what this particular deal entails, or rather the tariffs and the ruling entails. But before that, let's quickly take a look at some reactions from Donald Trump.
On the trade deal, which is the framework which is to be signed with India sometime soon, will that stand now?
Yeah,
and on the decision,
changes.
Nothing changes?
No, nothing changes. They'll be paying tariffs, and we will not be paying tariffs. Our deal with India is they pay tariffs. This is a reversal from what it used to be, as you know. India, and I think Prime Minister Modi is a great gentleman, a great man, actually, but he was much smarter than the people that he was against in terms of the United States. He was ripping us off in India. So we made a deal with India, and it's a fair deal now, and we are not paying tariffs to them, and they are paying tariffs. We did a little flip. The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what's right for our country. I'd like to thank and congratulate Justices Thomas, Alito, and Kavanaugh for their strength and wisdom and love of our country, which is right now very proud of those justices. When you read the dissenting opinions, there's no way that anyone can argue against them. There's no way. Foreign countries that have been ripping us off for years are ecstatic. They're so happy. And they're dancing in the streets, but they won't be dancing for long, that I can assure you.
Now, amid all this, the question still remains, where does India then stand in terms of the trade deal that was already in the works with the United States amid the Trump tariff episode, this latest episode? And we're being joined by a panel to discuss this in further depth. Joining me is Siddharth Zarrabi, Group Editor of Business Today. We also have Prabhu Dayal, former diplomat, and Dr. Ashutosh Kamal Dutta, international conservative expert. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Siddharth, I'll quickly first take a question from you. I just want you to translate what this entire 18% and 10% tariff currently mean, because the trade deal framework that was announced in that joint statement had 18% as the amount for India as to how much it would be taxed by the United States. But now, in the last 24 hours, with all that's happened, there is a question of this 10% global tariff that's come into the equation. What exactly does this mean for India?
Okay, this is the most important point. Where do we stand? It's not clear because remember, this is a situation that's been developing literally in the past few hours. We were at 18%. As of now, if you take into account the effective rate after Trump's punitive tariffs, reciprocal tariffs were struck down by the US Supreme Court, for India, the effective rate, according to various analysis, was 8.3%. If we take the new 10% global tariff, and this is important, the terminology is important, If we take that 10% and superimpose it here, that means we are back thereabouts at 18.3%. So pending clarifications, pending, the final announcement, the nitty gritty, it seems that we are back at about the same level once we announced our trade deal. Why is this a bit of a confusion? Because it was not one. There are fentanyl tariffs that seem to have been struck down. There are other elements, including aluminum duties from the past, previous tariffs, even before Trump's actions. All of that aggregated, it seems as of now that we are at the same level as it was, and therefore it isn't something that has swung too much on both sides of the equation.
Right, Siddharth. Siddharth, do stay with us. Let me just quickly bring in Mr. Dayal and Dr. Dutta into the conversation here. You know, gentlemen, I have this question for both of you. So I'll start with you, Mr. Dayal, that at this point, with whatever's happened in the last 24 hours, is India then at a better position to renegotiate, if not renegotiate rather, maybe talk about that percentage that, as Siddharth was also mentioning, the 18% that's been put in that very deal, can that be renegotiated with this SC ruling coming into the picture now?
You know, the purpose of a trade deal is to work out more favorable terms. Now, the 18% tariff will not be favorable, but unfavorable. Imports from India will cost more rather than less. We should bear this in mind. You know, when the US will be paying zero tariffs on its exports to India, then why should it be charging 18% tariffs on imports from India when it will be charging just 10% from a whole host of other countries with which it doesn't have a trade deal? Following the US Supreme Court verdict yesterday, which struck down the broad punitive tariffs imposed by the Trump administration, the legal landscape for the existing agreement has shifted. Now, despite the court ruling, President Trump has stated that the current framework with India remains intact and he does not intend to reopen the deal. However, the deal is not yet fully finalized, and India should be in a position to renegotiate the details of the arrangements. Now, Indian and American negotiators are scheduled to meet in the US on 23rd February for 3 days of talks to finalize the legal text of an interim trade agreement. Now, the Indian government should try to use the Supreme Court's ruling as a leverage to renegotiate for a more favorable sort of deal, because otherwise, you know, our exports, for instance, of agricultural items or textiles will become expensive as compared to exports from countries which will only be paying 10%. That is my view.
Right, right. So you do think that there should be a renegotiation that takes place at that meeting, which is upcoming between the two nations. Dr. Datta, this is where I bring you into the conversation here. You know, with all that's happened, one thing still, of course, we still haven't seen a response from the Indian government yet with regards to these very developments that's taken place in the last 24 hours. Where do you stand on the renegotiation and renegotiating point? Do you think India should, in fact, take advantage of this situation and at least try and renegotiate for a better term, given that there are countries that definitely will be paying that global 10% tariff that's now been introduced? And Trump, of course, at the same time has warned that I may even push forward to increase that to a 15%, because 15% is where the cap comes in within Section 122 of that very act.
See, there are three very important things which I would like to point out here. First and foremost, I do not buy the logic of the leader of the opposition that the prime minister doesn't have the authority to renegotiate this deal, because this deal, even if the Supreme Court hearing would not have taken place and the decision of the Supreme Court would not have come, then also this deal would have been operational only from March onwards, after the US delegation would come here and sign the agreement. So as of now, the deal is not yet operational. So the Honorable Prime Minister of Bharat has every right to renegotiate this deal. That's one. The second thing is like the American Constitution is very clear. If on a presidential order that is struck down by the Supreme Court of United States of America, then it becomes binding on the president and his office to agree by that order. The American Constitution also gives in enough rights to the Supreme Court of United States of America that if the order is violated, then the Supreme Court can direct the Congress for impeachment of the Honorable President of United States of America. So the battle of President Trump with the Supreme Court is not yet over. The second thing is like 18%, if I take it that way, then I do understand and I vehemently would say that it has to be reciprocal. If they are imposing 18% on us, we also should impose 18% on them, and it has to be that way. It has to be a bilateral deal. It cannot be a one-way traffic. That's one. The second thing is like if there is a utter confusion between President Trump as well as between the spokesperson of United States of America as well as Washington. President Trump says that 18% is valid. Spokesperson and official of of Washington, they say that it is 10% now at the global level. So when the deal is not yet operational, then in that case the same logic should apply. If it is 10% for the global world, then it has to be 10% for India also. That's the third thing. The fourth thing is like when President Trump says that it is 18%, and there is some other version coming from Washington, I think government of India should come up with a clarity regarding this. And I do understand that sooner or later, the Indian government and the spokesperson of the External Affairs Ministry would give in a detailed clarification. What I do understand right now is like there is utter confusion in United States of America itself, in Washington, D.C., in White House itself about the verdict of the Honorable Supreme Court of United States of America. President Trump is giving one kind of version. The officials of White House is giving another kind of version. So I think we need to wait for some time more. It is still premature to assume and to presume things. Let us wait for another 48 hours or so, and I think there would be a complete clarity regarding this.
There is, I'll definitely say this, that there is a lot of confusion for the last 24 hours. In fact, way less than 24 hours, just 12 hours, we have seen a lot of confusion. So that I'll come back to you for another clarification on that fact sheet that's been released by the White House. You know, when we speak of Trump's tariffs, it's a complex structure. It's not just a simple 18% that we're speaking of against India. It's not just a simple 25% before it was reduced to 18% that we're speaking of. It's a structure in itself which is extremely complex. Now, when we speak of the SC ruling caters to the emergency powers that's been cited by President Donald Trump while imposing certain tariffs against nations. So where does this global tariff 10% play a role at this point in considering in context of all of the tariffs that were already existing? Because it's not one tariff that we're discussing of. Where do the first term tariffs then go? Where do the other tariffs which came in as, punitive tariffs, where do they go? Is it an additional 10% to those, or is this a replacing 10% tariff that we are now talking about?
It's quite understandable, the question that you put, because remember, Trump's tariffs have not been one single announcement. He has done it in a layered way. And there are tariffs that have been carried over from his first presidency also, which were not taken away by the Biden administration. So this is very important for us to understand. There are different rules or legislations under which President Trump has acted in the past and during his current second term as president. When you even that out, what the US Supreme Court has said is that one kind of tariff imposition invoking a certain emergency power is invalid. It's a legal ruling basis the law on which the US president has acted. It doesn't mean that the US Supreme Court has ruled on whether tariffs can be imposed, whether they are a sovereign right. It has not gone into the material or economic questions that come up with tariffs. They are definitely now being seen as taxes. That is what the person who won this case, incidentally, Indian origin Neil Katyal, who acted on behalf of small businesses in the United States, said after this ruling. So we will therefore have to wait for the nitty gritty. But it is clear there is a 10% rate, which is a new rate. And prior to Trump's punitive tariffs that he started bringing in from last year, whatever was the prevailing rate then, that 10% gets added on. So it's going to be different for different countries, certain countries which had neutral, most favored nation status. It's a complex mix, but it is clear that they haven't gone to zero, and yet they are not at 50%.
Mr. Dayal, I'll come back to you here into the conversation. Let me understand one thing. I want your insight with regards to where Trump stands at this point. We know him to be a person who's extremely unpredictable a leader. We know him to be a person who in fact, at this given point of time, it is this SC ruling that he has responded to in a way that the nations across the globe are looking at another 10% global tariff that's been introduced. So the structure keeps getting more and more complicated. For a person who doesn't, take a step back under such circumstances, but only responds with harsher steps moving forward, where do you think this is headed? Do you look at him, imposing more tariffs, maybe using different acts, citing different acts, because it is, at the end of the day, just that Emergency Powers Act that has been called out in this SC ruling?
Well, you're right. The only thing which is predictable about Donald Trump is that he is extremely unpredictable. And he has a big ego. And that ego has been badly hurt by the Supreme Court judgment. Now, let me state categorically that the judgment by the Supreme Court says that the president doesn't have the power to unilaterally impose tariffs. The judgment says that the law of the United States does not grant the president unlimited tariff powers under emergency provisions. Now, the judgment stressed that Article 1 of the Constitution vests the power to lay and collect taxes, which include tariffs, solely in the Congress. And it goes on to say that the framers did not vest any part of the taxing power in the executive branch. In other words, the executive branch, which is the Trump administration, will not have any authority for imposing taxes or tariffs. This is what the view of the Supreme Court is. And very categorically, it is emphasized that since this power belongs to the Congress, therefore, for imposing any tariffs, the Trump administration will have to take the Congress route. Now, there are certain other factors which have to be borne in mind and which you hinted. And these factors relate to, what is called the initiation of a new Section 301 investigations on an accelerated frame. Now, these investigations are expected to cover most trading partners, including India. And the primary objective of these investigations includes addressing practices relating to the pricing of pharmaceutical products, investigating discrimination against US technology companies and digital goods and services, and tackling industrial excess capacity, forced labor, and digital service taxes. So the US could still take resort to this provision and impose taxes on India one way or the other. So the whole scenario is fraught with all kinds of possibilities.
There is a bit of a catch-22 if we look at this entire situation. Of course, it's not all clear. It's not all black and white for sure from where we are looking at things, at least at this given point of time. Sorry to cut you short there, Mr. Dayal. We are completely out of time. So, Dr. Dutta, I'll just take one short response from you on the current situation. your point of view on where this entire situation is headed, given that Trump is not one to back down easily, and there's also the entire factor which he's already spoken about, that there is the balance for payment, for which reason he in fact ended up imposing these tariffs in the first place. If he is able to in fact go ahead and prove that to both the Congress and the Supreme Court, then for that matter we might even see the tariffs that he had imposed earlier come back into function and come back into execution.
Yes, there is a possibility there because President Trump, as a person, he's extremely whimsical. He's a highly egoist person, and on top of that, he's a very big bully. So it's quite obvious that the ruling of the Supreme Court is a direct slap on his ego, and he's not able to, digest that, and he will come up with more irrational and whimsical decisions. That's the reason why I'm saying that the government of Bharat has to be very stern in its negotiation. And there is a provision for renegotiation of this whole deal because this deal is not yet operational. That's one thing. The second thing is like under the emergency provision through which President Trump had announced all this series of measures in relation to lethal tariff. This is something which has been cut down and has been made null and void by the Supreme Court of United States of America. And that is something which is binding on him. Whether he likes it or not, he has to take the Congress route now. And sooner or later, he would do it. It's just that he will be crying foul about it. And I'm sure he will be taking several U-turns one after another in the coming few days.
Right. Dr. Dutta, thank you so much. And Mr. Dayal, thank you so much for joining us. Siddharth, thank you for your inputs on this particular development that's taken place. Of course, India at this given point of time, viewers, is very keenly watching because there is a trade deal with the United States that's in the work, and that is why we are in fact very not just keenly watching what is exactly going on in the United States, but also cautiously, maybe if there is room for renegotiation at this given point of time or not. All of that will in fact come in as the meeting between the two nations, which is scheduled to take place in the upcoming weeks, takes place.